Welcome, everybody, to Brothers Sisters Estrangement. This is our third episode with regards to our talk on sibling estrangement. And I'm Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist. I'm here with Fern Chapman, author. And we, of course, wanted to discuss more about communication today because we're going to be starting a new format that is going to be for about 10 minutes today. And we'd like to discuss a little bit more about what's going on in the world right now, because obviously there's lots going on. And communication certainly seems to be one of the themes that needs to be brought up. Now, I'm not a stranger to, of course, different forms of racism myself. And I think that it's also interesting for us to talk more about that in terms of where communication can break down potentially and what can be useful to improve communication.
My name is Fern Chapman, and I am the author of the upcoming book, Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, Sibling Estrangement, and the Road to Reconciliation. And I am fascinated and unfortunately a victim of sibling estrangement. I've recently reconciled with my brother and have had a sustaining relationship for the last 5 or 6 years. So I look forward to talking to you again, Ali John.
Excellent. I'm glad you're here, Fern. So I think that a lot of times, there's certain skills that are sometimes missing in families that can sometimes affect people negatively as they grow up and as they become adults all throughout their lives. I was wondering what your experiences were with that.
Well, I think you raise a really good point. There are actually risk factors for estrangement, and my family was riddled with risk factors. And one of the biggest ones is that communication skills weren't modeled. So if you don't learn as a child how to resolve conflict, you are likely as an adult to lack those skills. So what do people do when they haven't had that training? Well, they tend to walk out. They cut off from relationships because they don't know what else to do. They don't know how to cool off and to revisit the topic once again. And I think it's crucial if you have that lack of skill that you find a way to learn how to do it, so that you can have successful relationships in the family and then in the larger world.
Absolutely. I would agree with you. And I think that those are really important to recognize also how it is that we can learn to be better communicators overall. I know that in some cases, there can be different reasons for why a communication can break down. And we've mentioned a couple of them, I think, just previously by talking with one another, but maybe our viewers would like to know a couple of them just off the bat that can sometimes be present in relationships.
Well, I think there are lots of risk factors for why sibling estrangement sets in. And like I said, one of the biggest one is lack of skills. But oftentimes it occurs when somebody marries somebody outside the family comfort zone. So if somebody's lifestyle is different, or if they are gay, or if they marry somebody out of the faith, or all of these reasons seem to defy the family myth. And sometimes the family feels like they want to cast that person out rather than negotiate with the new in-law.
That's very true. I would say that there's a form of in-law alienation that we can certainly get into more, I think, in another podcast, but that's certainly something that that could be discussed and needs to be acknowledged more also.
But where do we begin to repair communication skills that aren't modeled in the early life and in the family?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think that, talking about communication at home, how it was for certain people, I know that, again, if you don't learn these early on, it can carry through with you for the rest of your life. And I do recall speaking in one of my videos about this, about the lack of communication by just saying, well, why can't you guys get along, without the parents actually showing the kids how to get along. So this is something that I think needs to be discussed more. And I can get into one of the models that I've talked to you about previously. There's something called the Four Horsemen Model. But before I do that, I just wanted to check, were there any specific experiences that you had on your home front that you thought would be interesting for our viewers to know?
Well, I do think that one breakdown in communication is passive aggressive behavior. So
Mm-hmm.
when you're trying to read the tea leaves and anticipate behavior, and you're getting wind of something wrong, but you don't really know what it is or how to address it. And when those kinds of skills are modeled in the family, it's really hard to figure out how do you sit down and actually listen and hear somebody else who has an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the tendency is to marry somebody, if you're not aware of this, who has the same kind of skills. And so you've created, then again, this second family that struggles with those issues. My own family, yeah, there was a lot more yelling than talking. And there's certainly, my mother was a Holocaust refugee, and the way she coped with all of her losses is she never wanted to speak of her history. Well, that removed a whole set of conversations from the table. And
Mm-hmm.
as a result, our relationships were somewhat limited.
I would understand that, how that would be the case. And there's all sorts of reasons that contribute to estrangement, and as you say, passive aggressiveness is one of them. And I think that's a great segue into the Four Horsemen of communication. That's a great model that actually serves us here, because the Four Horsemen, in a nutshell, are essentially poisons to any relationships. This is a type of paradigm that's usually used for couples, but I find that it applies to pretty much anybody. And the first one has to do with constructive or destructive criticism. So that's very important, to be careful in how you say things and to learn to sugarcoat. You know, sugarcoating is not a bad thing, and so long as you don't lose sight of your message being too convoluted. So that's one thing to be mindful of. I think if parents have anything to learn and to teach their children, it would be that. Number two would be defensiveness.
I assume that's the stroke and poke model.
Yeah, we could say that. Exactly. That's a good way to say it. Yeah, in a nutshell, stroke and poke is good. And the second part is defensiveness, of course. You know, with anything that escalates, it's going to turn into defensiveness. So the idea is to kind of recognize content versus process here, you know, to be kind of aware of the process of you becoming defensive or the other person being defensive. Because what ends up happening is it becomes a one-up match where everybody kind of wants to one-up one another in that way. Oh, you said this, well, I'll say this. I'll bring this up. And it goes back and forth, and it just escalates from there. So,
and that's the blame game.
That's the blame game, exactly. Yes, yes. So be careful about your participation in that to de-escalate that. And just to point it out is sometimes enough to say, oh, I'm doing that. Okay, maybe I should step back from that. The third horseman is contemptuousness, or lack of respect. So that has to do with the notion of using words that are insulting, demeaning, you know, crossing that line, hitting below the belt. So thinking of hitting below the belt is probably a good way of saying, you know, that's not what you want to do. And sometimes when we're hurt, we have the reflex of lashing out. So it's important for us to be mindful of that. So
I call that the dukes up approach.
that makes sense, yeah. So that's important to be careful with that. And of course, the final one is stonewalling. You know, if it's going to be like that, well, I'm not going to talk, and people just, you know, shut down. So,
and that's the model for estrangement.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So there we go with estrangement right there. So it's important to recognize what happens and how that can build potentially. So I just thought our viewers would like to know how that can apply to the whole communication theme for today.
And those very four elements are also a key part of the dignity model that Dr. Diane Hicks has created in her book, Dignity, Its Essential Role in Resolving Conflict. And she actually applies this not just personally, but on an international stage. So she's having different groups sit down who might have been participating even in genocide. So you can see that it can go from very small to how you communicate in a family to very large. How do you communicate in a community?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think that's part of the sad reality of what we're living in right now in the United States, where people, groups of people, do not know how to communicate with each other. And suddenly, in terms of race, we have to start from ground zero.
I agree. I think this is very important, and this is a very timely topic that we're mentioning here, because again, it can start very small. It can start within the family, and then it can really explode into bigger aspects, bigger macro aspects, so to speak, that can you know, have a more of an impact in the world and such, you know, and on a bigger level. So the more we learn about these skills, and the more we learn how to humanize people, I think, as opposed to breaking down communication, potentially dehumanizing them and demonizing them, therein lies, I think, the key to be able to harmonize ourselves further with both our family and, of course, society in general.
Well, Diane Hicks says that you have to invest the other person with dignity and give them a sense of their inherent worth and value. And if you don't do that, they end up asking these really fundamental questions, which I think you hear in the Black Lives Matter movement. And they are questions like, how can you treat me like this? Can't you see we are human beings? Can't you see that we are suffering? And so I think these models are crucial, as I said earlier, not just in the family, but on a larger stage.
So that was very insightful what you just said there, Fern. I really appreciate that. We're already at 10 minutes, so we're going to have to wrap it up for today. My name is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist.
And I'm Fern Schumer Chapman, author.
Thank you so much, Fern, for being here. See you next time.